My name is Courtney Hayes. I'm 31 years old, and 5 years ago, I walked away from my family and never looked back. Last Sunday, I almost didn't go. The invitation came out of nowhere, a formal message sent through someone else, like I was a distant relative instead of a daughter. A family party. A celebration. My mother had remarried. That alone should have meant something, but after everything that had happened, I wasn't sure I still had a place in that house. Still, I went. The house sat behind iron gates in one of those quiet Texas communities where everything looks perfect from the outside. Inside, it was exactly what you'd expect: music, laughter, people holding glasses, acting like nothing had ever been broken. Her new husband moved through the room like he owned it, shaking hands, telling stories, smiling at exactly the right moments. Everyone liked him. It was effortless. And then it happened. In the middle of all that noise, my mother looked straight at me. She was smiling, but her eyes didn't match it. She blinked once, twice, 3 times, slow and deliberate. It wasn't random. It wasn't nervous. It was our code. The one we only ever used when something was very wrong. In that moment, surrounded by people celebrating her new life, I realized something no one else could see. She wasn't happy. She was asking for help. Before I tell you what happened next, I want to ask you something. What time are you watching this, and what city are you in right now? Let me know in the comments so I can see how far this story has reached. And if stories like this keep you thinking, make sure to subscribe and stay with me until the end. Growing up in that house never felt like belonging. Courtney didn't remember a single moment where she was treated the same as her older sister, not even in small, ordinary things. If there was praise, it went to Vanessa. If there was patience, it was reserved for Vanessa. What Courtney received instead was comparison, quiet disappointment, and sometimes open ridicule that no one bothered to soften. It started early, in ways that were easy to dismiss from the outside, but impossible to ignore when you lived inside it. At dinner, her opinions were brushed aside before she could finish a sentence. At school events, her achievements were acknowledged with a nod, then immediately overshadowed by something her sister had done better. Even mistakes were treated differently. Vanessa's forgiven. Courtney's remembered and repeated like evidence. The imbalance wasn't hidden. It was part of the air in that house, something everyone adjusted to accept her. What stayed with her the most wasn't just how others treated her, but how her mother allowed it to happen. Marilyn never raised her voice, never directly said anything cruel, but she also never stepped in. Silence became its own kind of answer. There were moments Courtney waited, hoping for something to change. A single time her mother would defend her, correct the way things were tilted, but those moments passed without anything happening. Over time, she stopped expecting it. By the time she was old enough to leave, the decision didn't feel dramatic, it felt necessary. She packed what she needed, left without asking for permission, and didn't come back. No one tried to stop her. There were no calls asking where she was, no messages checking if she was safe. It was as if her absence solved something for them. For 5 years, she built a life that had nothing to do with that house, working, moving forward, learning how to exist without constantly being measured against someone else. The distance made things quieter, more stable, but it didn't erase what had already been set in place. When her father passed, she heard about it late, through someone who assumed she already knew. She didn't return for the funeral. Not because she didn't care, but because stepping back into that space meant stepping back into everything she had left behind. After that, whatever remained between her and her family faded into something distant and unspoken. They didn't reach out, and she didn't try. That silence lasted until the invitation arrived, formal and detached, carrying the kind of news that should have come with a phone call but didn't. Years later, everything changed without her. The first time Courtney heard about Douglas Mercer, it wasn't from her mother directly, but through a brief message passed along by someone else, as if the information didn't require explanation or context. A man had entered her mother's life, and from the way it was described, He seemed to fit perfectly into a space that had been empty for a long time. He was introduced as attentive, composed, someone who understood how to step into conversations without forcing them and how to make people feel at ease without drawing too much attention to himself. At first, Courtney didn't react strongly to it, not because it didn't matter, but because she had trained herself not to respond to anything connected to that household. Distance had become a boundary she relied on, and breaking it for a stranger didn't make sense. Over time, though, the updates became more frequent, and what stood out wasn't just his presence, but the speed at which everything around him seemed to shift. He wasn't just visiting, he was staying longer, involving himself in decisions that had nothing to do with him before, speaking as if he had always been part of the structure. Her mother, who had once moved carefully through her routines, began to reorganize her life around him, adjusting schedules, changing habits, making room in ways that felt immediate and complete. When Courtney finally saw a photo, it showed a man who looked exactly how people had described him: well-dressed, steady posture, a controlled kind of confidence that didn't need to be loud. There was nothing obviously wrong, nothing that could be pointed to as a reason for concern, yet something about how quickly he had settled into everything felt disproportionate. A few months later, another message arrived, this time carrying a different tone, more certain, less informational. They were getting married. The decision had been made without hesitation, without the kind of time people usually take to understand someone fully, and it was presented as something already resolved rather than something open for discussion. Courtney read it more than once, not because she needed clarity, but because she was trying to understand how something so permanent could happen so quickly without anyone questioning it. From what she could tell, no one had. The family accepted him without resistance, spoke about him as if he had always been there, and treated the situation as a natural progression rather than a sudden shift. Even the way her mother spoke about him changed, her words more certain, her tone more aligned with his presence than her own before. It wasn't just that he had entered her life, it was that everything around her had reorganized to include him, leaving no space where things used to be. By the time she stepped into that house, something already felt off. The neighborhood itself was quiet in a way that didn't feel welcoming, rows of identical homes behind controlled access, every movement filtered through security gates and monitored entry points, making it clear that nothing happened there without being noticed. Inside, the atmosphere shifted completely, filled with voices, glasses clinking, people moving through carefully arranged spaces, as if everything had been planned down to the smallest detail. Courtney stayed near the edge of the room at first, not out of discomfort, but out of habit, observing before stepping into conversations, watching how people interacted rather than immediately joining them. Douglas moved easily among the guests, adjusting his tone depending on who he was speaking to, offering just enough attention to make each person feel acknowledged without ever lingering too long in one place. It wasn't exaggerated, it was controlled, the kind of presence that looked natural until you paid closer attention to how consistent it was. Whenever Marilyn shifted position, he adjusted as well, never abruptly, never in a way that would draw attention, but always within reach, always aware of where she was and who she was speaking to. When someone asked her a question, there were moments he answered before she could, smoothly redirecting the conversation without making it obvious he had done so. The first time it happened, it could have been dismissed as enthusiasm, but as the evening continued, the pattern became clearer. Courtney noticed how her mother's responses shortened, how she deferred more often, how she allowed interruptions without pushing back, something that didn't match the woman she remembered, even from a distance. At one point, a relative made a light comment about how quickly everything had come together, and Douglas responded with a calm reassurance, placing a hand briefly on Marilyn's shoulder, his grip steady, not forceful, but firm enough to signal control beneath the gesture. The room accepted it as affection. Courtney didn't. She moved closer when she found an opening near the hallway, positioning herself beside her mother without drawing attention, lowering her voice just enough to keep it private. She said her name once, quietly, not as a question, but as a check, something simple that should have led to eye contact, to recognition, to a response that felt natural. Instead, Marilyn kept her gaze forward and answered in a tone that didn't match the setting, controlled, measured, telling her not to say anything right now. The words were calm, but the absence of hesitation made them stand out. Before Courtney could ask anything else, Douglas appeared beside them again, not suddenly, not aggressively, just present. As if he had always been standing there, his expression unchanged, his attention evenly divided, yet focused enough to signal that he had noticed the shift. The rest of the evening continued with the same rhythm, conversations flowing, people laughing, nothing outwardly wrong, but the details didn't align. Each time Marilyn reached for her phone, it didn't stay with her for long. Each time someone directed attention toward her, it subtly moved away before she could fully engage. By the time guests began to leave, Courtney stepped in to say goodbye, keeping the interaction brief, watching closely for anything that broke the pattern she had been seeing all night. When Marilyn leaned in to hug her, the contact lasted slightly longer than expected, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for a quiet shift to happen beneath the surface. Without changing her expression, without giving any visible sign that something was wrong, she spoke just low enough for Courtney to hear, telling her not to trust him. The next morning didn't feel normal anymore. Courtney didn't wait long before reaching out, not because she expected a clear answer, but because silence would have been worse. The first call didn't go through, the second rang longer before ending without response, and by the time she tried again, the pattern had already formed into something that didn't match routine behavior. When a message finally came through, it was brief and unusually formal, lacking the small details her mother typically included, structured in a way that felt distant rather than personal. Courtney read it more than once, not for meaning, but for tone, noticing how carefully neutral it sounded, as if it had been written with awareness rather than instinct. Instead of responding immediately, she showed it to Brandon, placing the phone between them without explanation, allowing him to read it in full before saying anything. He didn't react right away, which told her more than a quick answer would have. After a moment, he pointed out the same thing she had already sensed, that the message didn't align with how her mother usually communicated, not just in wording but in rhythm, as if something had interrupted the natural way she expressed herself. Rather than jumping to conclusions, he suggested looking at what could be verified first, starting with publicly available information, something that didn't rely on assumptions or emotional interpretation. They began with simple searches. Names, locations, records that could be accessed without raising attention, building a timeline from fragments that seemed unrelated at first. Douglas Mercer appeared consistent on the surface, with addresses that followed a logical progression and no immediate gaps that would stand out as suspicious. Yet the deeper they went, the more irregularities started to appear, not as obvious breaks, but as subtle shifts that didn't fully align. A previous address connected to a slightly different name, not completely unrelated, but altered enough to require a second look, then another variation further back, each one similar but not identical, creating a pattern that suggested adjustment rather than coincidence. Courtney didn't comment on it immediately, letting Brandon trace the sequence further until it formed something clearer, a line that connected multiple identities across different periods without ever fully settling into one. Before they could go further on their own, another piece entered unexpectedly. Elaine Foster reached out later that afternoon, not through a direct call, but through a message that carried a tone of hesitation, as if she had debated whether to say anything at all. Courtney recognized the name, but hadn't interacted with her in years, someone who had been part of her mother's social circle before everything changed. When they met, Elaine didn't start with explanations, instead asking a question that immediately shifted the direction of the conversation, whether Courtney knew how quickly the relationship had progressed beyond what she had been told. Without waiting for a response, she added that things had felt unusual even before the marriage, not in ways that could be easily described, but in how decisions seemed to happen without discussion, as if they had already been finalized before anyone else became aware of them. She mentioned noticing financial arrangements being adjusted quietly, not drastically enough to attract attention, but consistently enough to suggest a shift in control. Courtney listened without interrupting, allowing each detail to settle before connecting it with what they had already found. When Brandon shared the variations in Douglas's records, Elaine didn't appear surprised, which confirmed that the inconsistencies weren't new observations, but part of something that had been unfolding over time. The conversation didn't escalate, there were no dramatic conclusions. Just a gradual alignment of information that pointed in the same direction, each piece reinforcing the others without needing to be forced into place. By the time they left, what they had wasn't proof in a legal sense, but it was enough to establish that the situation wasn't isolated or accidental, that it followed a structure that had existed before and was now repeating itself in a different form. When she finally spoke, her voice didn't sound like hers anymore. Courtney didn't push it first, choosing instead to ask simple questions, leaving space for answers that didn't feel forced, but even then, the pauses between each response stretched longer than they should have, as if every word had to be measured before it could be said out loud. Marilyn didn't describe anything directly, not in a way that would immediately define the situation, but the way she explained it made something else clear, that control didn't arrive all at once, it settled in gradually, adjusting itself until it became part of her routine. It started with small changes, decisions that seemed reasonable at the time, accounts being reorganized for convenience, documents reviewed together, signatures added where they were said to be necessary. Each step framed as something practical rather than intrusive. There was no single moment that stood out as a mistake, which made it harder to question, because nothing felt wrong in isolation. Over time, though, those adjustments created a structure where nothing could move without passing through him first. Access became limited in ways that didn't look restrictive from the outside, but felt different when experienced from within. Marilyn explained that even conversations had begun to shift, not through direct interruption, but through suggestion, subtle corrections that guided what she said and how she said it, until it became easier to follow than to resist. Courtney listened without interrupting, letting the explanation unfold at its own pace, understanding that pushing too quickly would close it off again. When she asked what would happen if those expectations weren't followed, the answer didn't come immediately. Marilyn hesitated longer than before, then explained that he had kept certain things, moments from earlier conversations when she had been overwhelmed, recordings or fragments of what she had said during periods when she wasn't thinking clearly. Not fabricated, but taken out of the context they belonged to. He hadn't used them openly, he hadn't needed to, just mentioning that they existed was enough to shape her decisions, to make her reconsider any action that might create conflict. It wasn't framed as a threat, it was presented as a consequence, something that could happen if situations became difficult. Alongside that, there were financial expectations that had shifted over time, contributions that had started as shared responsibilities, but gradually moved toward full transfer, framed as temporary solutions that never returned to their original state. When Courtney asked why she hadn't said anything earlier, Marilyn didn't offer a clear explanation, only that there hadn't been an opportunity that felt safe. That timing never aligned in a way that allowed for a full conversation without interruption or oversight. The structure around her had tightened in ways that weren't visible from the outside, limiting not just what she could do, but how she could communicate it. Courtney didn't respond immediately, not because she didn't understand, but because the pattern now made sense in a way it hadn't before, connecting the observations from the night of the gathering with the information they had uncovered since then. Nothing about it was sudden, nothing about it was obvious, but taken together, it formed something deliberate, something designed to function quietly without drawing attention to itself. 2 days later, they stopped waiting. Courtney didn't announce anything before arriving, choosing instead to act before the situation could shift again, knowing that delay would only give more space for control to tighten further. When the door opened, Douglas Mercer greeted them the same way he had greeted everyone before, composed, steady, without any visible sign that he expected anything different, but the balance in the room changed the moment they stepped inside. Brandon remained near the entrance, not positioned aggressively, but present in a way that made it clear he wasn't there as a guest, while Courtney moved forward without hesitation, placing a folder on the table that had been prepared carefully. Not with assumptions, but with records, timelines, and connections that had been verified from multiple sources. Douglas didn't react immediately, his expression holding for a second longer than usual before shifting into something more controlled, less open, as he asked what exactly they thought they were doing. Courtney didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The information in front of him carried enough weight on its own, and as Brandon began outlining what they had found, the structure that had been built quietly started to break under direct attention. The variations in names, the sequence of past arrangements, the financial transitions that followed similar patterns, none of it was presented dramatically. It was laid out in a way that made denial difficult without contradicting documented facts. For the first time, Douglas didn't guide the conversation. He tried to redirect it, shifting between dismissal and explanation, but the consistency he had maintained before was no longer there. Marilyn stood a few steps away, not speaking at first, but no longer positioned behind him, her attention fixed on the documents as if seeing them for the first time, even though the structure they described had already been part of her life. When she finally spoke, it wasn't to defend or to explain, it was to confirm that what had been presented aligned with what she had experienced, removing the last layer of control he had relied on. The room didn't escalate into chaos. There were no raised voices or sudden movements, but the shift was clear. The dynamic that had held everything in place was no longer functioning the same way. Douglas stepped back, not physically retreating, but losing the position he had maintained, his responses becoming less precise, less measured, until silence replaced them entirely. What followed moved quickly in a different direction. Formal steps taken without hesitation, reports filed, documentation submitted, actions that transferred the situation out of the house and into a system where it could no longer be managed quietly. The outcome didn't resolve overnight, but the control he had built didn't hold once it was exposed, and whatever remained of it didn't return to the structure it had before. Courtney didn't stay after that. She didn't wait for anything to settle, and she didn't attempt to rebuild what had never truly existed between her and that space. Leaving didn't feel like loss. It felt like continuation, a decision consistent with the one she had made years earlier. What changed was not her distance, but her understanding that silence can protect the wrong person just as easily as it can protect the right one. And that recognizing something is wrong doesn't mean anything unless it's followed by action. She didn't return to fix what had already been broken, and she didn't stay to repair relationships that had never held her in place to begin with. Some things, once seen clearly, don't need closure, they need distance, and sometimes the only way forward is to leave them exactly where they stand and not look back.